Thanks for joining us, Ford, for this Return of the Icons webinar, focusing on the restitution of African artifacts and human remains. Before we proceed further, there's a musical interlude from the UK's leading calypsonian, Alexander the Great, continuing the African cultural tradition of using our griots or jalis to reflect on issues and to open up proceedings. So, Alexander the Great, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good day, everybody. National Gallery, been playing its part, putting on a show of African art. Our forefathers' sweat produced what you see, and we stand in line paying money. Bring back the heart of Africa, give back the art which belongs to her. Bring back the soul of Africa, the wealth you stole she must recover. Relight the flame of Africa, let us reclaim the diaspora. Give back the art which has gone so far, bring back the heart of Africa. Oh, 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 oh. The dark continent was raped by the rest, who carried their spoils north, east and west, in skin and in wood, in ivory and stone. The carcass is picked clean to the bone. Bring back the heart of Africa, give back the art which belongs to her. Bring back the soul of Africa, the wealth you stole she must recover. Relight the flame of Africa, let us reclaim the diaspora. Give back the art which has gone so far, bring back the heart of Africa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. In 100 lands, the African race is represented in many a face. Most other peoples keep hold of their past. Now must be the time for we at last bring back the heart of Africa, give back the art which belongs to her. Bring back the soul of Africa, the wealth they stole she must recover. Relight the flame of Africa, let us reclaim the diaspora. Give back the art which has gone so far, bring back the heart of Africa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Bring back the heart of Africa.
Thank you, Alex the Great.
Alexander D. Great with the letter D, or you might find somebody else there. Thank you very much.
And the performance is on the website if you're looking for it, as he says, Alexander the Great. Thank you very much. The Heart of Africa was written in 1996. So these issues of restitution have been long-standing amongst Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. But in the last 20 years, they've gained increasing urgency. Why? It's important to recognize that in 1907, on the 100th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, there were no ceremonies that we are aware of that marked the occasion. Indeed, Britain was knee-deep in empire and the colonial project. Fast forward, however, a century later in 2007, and a year was dedicated to marking the bicentenary of the event with a national service in Westminster Abbey, attended by the Queen and the then Prime Minister. So what changed? The empire obviously was dissolved, and with the end of South Africa in 1994, the chapter on codified slavery, colonization, and second-class citizenship of Africans was closed. And since then, there has been an accounting and reckoning for the terrible events that happened during that age. At Afford, we talk about this accounting under the 8 R's: recognition and acknowledgement of the injustices and crimes of slavery and colonialism, remembrance of the victims, restoration of dignity, restitution of physical artifacts and human remains, financial and psychological reparations, followed by physical and mental reconnections amongst global Africans, and then the physical human return, as has been achieved by communities such as the Rastafarian community in Ethiopia. And then the final are reconstruction of and the healing of the severed African world. In the context of restitution and the cultural R, there has been a lot of movement as a result of the recent publication of the Savoy report commissioned by the French president. And this has added arguments to the restitution of artifacts and human remains. As we have seen in our mapping survey, which will be deliberated upon later on by the panelists, and which is incidentally the largest survey of diaspora attitudes on these issues. And as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, these demands to right the wrongs of the legacies of slavery, empire, and colonialism are only likely to increase. Our groundbreaking mapping report and policy brief has identified 4 pathways in which restoration can be carried out. I want to thank the Open Society Foundation for their support in producing this report. And the report provides us a focus for deliberations, engagement, and action. My colleague Paul Asquith will shortly present the key findings. He will then introduce our moderator for the day, Dr. Janice Chedi, who will continue the debate with our panelists of critical stakeholders. Please handle your questions in the chat box during the sessions. And so without further ado, I introduce Paul Asquith, lead author of the report. And just in case I didn't introduce myself at the start, I'm Onyekachi Wambu, the Executive Director of Afford. So welcome to this important session. And Paul, please give us the key recommendations.
Thank you, Onyekachi, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Asquith. I'm Engagement and Policy Manager at Afford, and I'm going to talk through very briefly the key findings and recommendations from our Return of the Icons mapping research. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so hopefully technology won't be against us. Okay. Now, hopefully you can all see my screen. Thank you. So yes, I'm here today to talk about this piece of research that we did as part of Return of the Icons programme. And we surveyed diaspora communities and museum professionals between January and May of this year. And as Onyekachi's already noted, this was the largest survey to date of diaspora respondents in the UK around this issue. We had 184 diaspora respondents who took part in an online survey and 3 focus group discussions. And we also conducted 22 semi-structured interviews with museum professionals and diaspora cultural experts. And in terms of the key findings, well, most of the respondents were based in the UK, majority predictably were in London and the South East, and most respondents were aged between 25 and 65 years old. The overwhelming majority, so nearly 80%, felt strongly that stolen African artifacts and human remains should be returned to their country or communities of origin. And interestingly, 40% of the diaspora respondents said that they'd visited a museum or gallery in the last year. And this is consistent with user engagement surveys from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. In terms of key findings from the conversations we had with practitioners in the museum and cultural institutions sector, we found that processes for the return of human remains are already far better developed, and there are already existing models of good practice for the return of human remains that could and should be extended to stolen artefacts. All museum staff interviewed stressed the need for their institutions to deal with remains and artefacts with dignity. All also stated, unprompted I should add, that they supported the decolonisation agenda. And just to clarify in terms of context, the fieldwork for this piece of research was carried out in January to April, so really before the whole kind of Black Lives Matter protest started off. And another interesting finding is that the number of formal requests for return of objects is limited. Some institutions have had very few, if any, requests for returns. And also, not all collections have fully catalogued the African artifacts they hold. So, as Onyekachi's already outlined, we discovered that there were 4 main pathways for return of stolen artifacts, but the principal barrier we discovered were the legal restrictions, specifically on national collections in the UK, that prevent them from returning stolen artifacts. There is also an issue of a gap in perception between diaspora communities and museum professionals and the broader public on this issue of returns and restitutions. Although the recent Black Lives Matter protests and statues being toppled on either side of the Atlantic suggests that this gap may not be quite as unbridgeable as I might have thought, certainly myself, back in January or February. And as Onyekachi's outlined, we identified 4 main pathways for return. The first is changes in law through Parliament. The second is through legal test cases. The third would be through voluntary return agreements. These would apply specifically to institutions that aren't covered by the National Museum legislation. And finally, other forms of return, such as revolving or long-term loans, use of replicas, etc. And in terms of our key recommendations, I've structured these going from the general to the specific. We're going to start with governments. So our first recommendation is that the UK, along with other European governments and the European Commission, should take a broader and more international view of the issues relating to the restitution of African artefacts, precisely in order to strengthen bilateral ties with African states. And as you can probably guess, this takes on an added urgency in the context of the UK's new Global Britain foreign and trade policy, and also with regard to the issues of slavery, colonialism and structural racism that the Black Lives Matter movement has put on the agenda in recent months. We also recommend that African governments should extend diplomatic and advocacy efforts for restitution of stolen artefacts and remains from UK museums and other cultural institutions. And the UK and other European governments and the European Commission should support capacity building of African institutions and the development of the culture and heritage sectors in African economies. Now, in terms of specific recommendations for the UK government, well, our first recommendation is that the UK government should sit on the UNESCO Intergovernmental Committee for the Return of Cultural Property. We also argued that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport should fund a comprehensive mapping exercise of African artefacts held in UK institutions in partnership with diaspora organisations and make the results of this mapping exercise freely and digitally available. We also argue that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport should host an international roundtable with key museum and heritage sectors on the issue of restitution of African objects and human remains in UK museums involving the diaspora, in order to develop a comprehensive mapping remit of the objects held and identified so that they can be returned, shared, loaned or copied. Through the British Council, we argue the British government should support the training and professional development of Africa-based curators, archivists and other museum and heritage professionals through the development of international partnerships with UK-based institutions. Now, in terms of our recommendations for museums and cultural institutions, we argue that the Arts Council England should establish and fund a specialist subject network on African artefacts with a view to developing specialist knowledge on African artefacts held within UK collections and also to share good practice on the issues of restitution. We also argue that the Arts Council's forthcoming guidance on restitution and repatriation for UK museums should hear from African and diaspora communities through hosting of a one-day seminar. We recommend that the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum and others should fund the training and professional development of partner African museums through a funded PhD programme over the next 10 years. And we also suggest that the British Library should research and develop a new online portal to provide access to previously undigitised British Library archive materials relating to African history. And we also argue that the International Council on Museums UK, in partnership with the British Council, should host an international conference on restitution of African artefacts. Finally, in terms of our recommendations for civil society and community groups, groups and campaigns for the return of stolen African artefacts should be supported to coordinate more effectively to help build momentum and public support and to carry out advocacy campaigns. We argue that improved coordination between campaigns and improved capacity and resources can act as a force multiplier to strengthen their impact. We recommend that a Afford should hold individual seminars on each approach with campaign groups, museums and heritage practitioners in order to identify key priorities for campaigning and restitution. We also would like Afford to work with the Black Studies Association and others to develop an advocacy network on collections of African artefacts in UK museums and heritage collections and their restitution, with the view to hosting an annual event on International Museums Day to highlight current issues. The Black Studies Association, we recommend, along with other stakeholders, should advocate for more comprehensive teaching of Britain's colonial past in schools and the history of the acquisition of cultural artefacts in developing collections of British institutions. And finally, there is a need to research and identify key communities of practice within Africa and within African institutions to inform the focus on future priorities of any advocacy campaign for restitution of African artefacts and human remains. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for putting up with me. I'm now going to hand you over to our moderator, Dr. Janice Cheddi. If you can just bear with me a second while my system reboots slightly. So yes, Janice Cheddi, Dr. Janice Cheddi is a writer, researcher and consultant. From 2005 to 2009, she was the lead consultant on the Heritage Diversity Task Force for the GLA in London, an editor with Makeda Kostan of Embedding Shared Heritage for the GLA in London 2009. She's a member of ICOMOS UK Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee and was part of the editorial team for ICOMOS UK Exploring Intangible Heritage in Museum Contexts, a pilot project publication. In 2019, she was a member of the 1989 collective that presented 1989, This is Tomorrow, Decanonization and Decolonization Conference, Courtauld Institute of Art, London. And she's currently completing a short film on the impact of COVID-19. So thank you, Janice, and thank you, everyone. We look forward to the panel discussion.
Hi, I'm just going to introduce the panel. I wonder if you could put your video on, Tristram, Elsie, and Dan Hicks. Great, thank you. So the panelists today are Dr. Tristram Hunt from the Victoria and Albert Museum, Ms. Elsie Owusu from Just Ghana, and Professor Dan Hicks from the Prince Rivers Museum. And I'd really like to start with perhaps, which was mentioned in the introduction, around the impact of the Savoy report. And how do you think developments in this field across Europe have affected institution policies on restitution and the restoration of stolen artifacts and human remains? I wonder if we could start with you, Tristram.
Well, good afternoon, Janice. Thank you. Very nice to see everyone. And can I first of all congratulate Paul and Afford on this really impressive and wide-ranging and scholarly report, which I think provides a really exciting and interesting pathway forward. So it's great work, and I hope actually one of the outcomes of the conversation today is that it seems to me we should get this report in front of members of Parliament. We should get this report in front of the National Museum Directors Conference. This seems a kind of good space to kickstart the conversation. In terms of the Savoy report, which I thought was, again, a remarkable piece of work, but I felt it was it had a very French feel to it, in that it was a kind of totalizing statist response to the challenge of repatriation and restitution. And in its incredible radicalism, which to my mind entailed the return pretty much of most artifacts from colonial origins between 1880 and 1960 at a bilateral state-to-state level, didn't, from the perspective of somewhere like the V&A, sort of take the conversation forward that effectively. We were, in a rather kind of British way, in a sense, much more interested in focusing on the kind of partnerships and relationships, and we can come on to talk about this in the future, that we were building up around the world at a more kind of incremental and organic level. So I thought Savoy-Sarr was really interesting, but I thought it was a French approach, and in Britain we could pursue a slightly different template.
I understand, Dan, that you have a different take on that, and I wonder if you could also bring in your work on the Benin Dialogue Group in response to what Tristram has just said, and also generally about the Savoy report, please.
Of course, yes. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in order just initially to echo a lot of what has just been said, the Savoy report, operates in a French context, and of course that sort of centralization of objects in a French context is very different, to what we have in the UK. I think, among its sort of benefits was, if you like, a notion of a sort of typological approach to the range of objects and the ways that they found their way, out of Africa into the European, sort of institutions. So on the one side, they talk about objects that were taken with violence. Also, though, they sort of look at objects that were taken archaeologically, or objects that were taken in other conditions. So part of what we learned from that report is that those sorts of object histories are enormously important, and we need maybe to nuance our approaches according to those different sort of histories. But in the UK, really, I think that the fact that all these objects are not in one location, and absolutely this is not about a state conversation only, really means that we have to sort of turn this into a national dialogue. So at this moment, I think across Europe, you've got an awareness of histories of empire, an awareness of how these life histories of objects are a part of a national story that we just don't learn about in school, that we need to face up to as a society. So, I mean, I absolutely hope that, we'll be seeing sort of conversations about, restitution across the UK, in Manchester, Edinburgh, Belfast, all these museums across the country that, that have objects. And importantly, of course, legally, the non-nationals haven't got the same hold-ups that absolutely we understand are there for the national institutions.
Elsie, I'd like to bring you in, and if you could talk a little bit about your own experience with the Ashanti artifacts, and if you could talk to that in relationship, if you think that the Savoy report has had any impact on your work. You're on mute. Sorry, Elsie. Could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. I think the Savoy report is probably, as Tristram said, doesn't really speak too much to the UK experience. And there are just two things I'd like to mention, which is the speech that William Gladstone made 149 years ago, and it'll be 150 years ago on the 30th of June next year, in which he advocated the return of Ethiopian treasures, which had been captured by General Napier on his so-called punitive expedition And Gladstone was very firm that those objects should never have been taken in the first place, and they should be returned as soon as possible. So I think that, to me, that that history of the Abuna's crown and chalice, which I think is in your collection, if I'm right in saying that, I'd be quite interested in knowing, Tristram, whether you think that that legacy and the very strong speech that Prime Minister Gladstone made could have an effect on the return of those items. I don't know, maybe they're about to be returned, but that would be helpful to know. The second is the Ashanti treasures, which again were taken on another punitive expedition, which is an interesting term, by the general who was the very model of a modern major general. And I think again are held in, well, I've seen them actually just recently at the V&A. And my understanding with that is that the Ashanti Kingdom has never formally asked for the return of those treasures. And so my question on that is, if there was a formal request for return, could they be returned? So in 1995, I worked on a project called the Gallery for Returning Treasures, which was a student competition. And the idea of the Gallery for Returning Treasures is that the items which had been stolen would be returned to their origin, but there would be a staging post in which academic research would be done, conditions for curatorship and display would be looked at. So there's a whole, I think there's a whole part of the journey which years later, since 1995, I think the serious conversation is beginning. And when Bernie Grant and I were campaigning with Onikachi in respect of the Africa reparations movement, it was considered to be absurdly radical. And it's just very interesting that all these years later, decades later, things have come round to the point where those aspirations now seem much more reasonable.
Okay, thank you. The report just launched identifies 4 pathways to restitution. So the legal challenge, the legal test cases, the voluntary return, and other forms of return. I mean, drawing on your own work, I mean, how can institutions, campaigns, or communities in the UK work together to deliver restitution? And the supplementary question, I think, to that is, in reality, is the only way forward now a legal test case which provides the basis for and the parameters and framework for change? I'll turn to you, Dan, if you could respond, please.
Of course, yeah. So yeah, I mean, in order actually, you know, just to respond to the points that was made over Ethiopia and Ashanti material, you know, I actually here in Oxford, I'm only about 100 yards away from Ashanti material and from Magdala material, here in Oxford, and those objects are across the country. So actually, there is a sense in which I think the non-national museums are offering leadership, at this time in a way that they're able to because of the different, legal framework. In terms of how we move ahead, next, I think it's really looking to actually how we understand different kinds of empire. So I think in the museums sector, we have felt ourselves to be really well, advanced in terms of how we talk about the source community work that happens in the context of the settler colonial, histories. However, we haven't, and I think in African history, this is enormously important. We haven't really addressed those other histories of empire that were much more military based, that were extractive, history. So I think we're just at the beginning, really, of moving as a sector to thinking about African objects.
Right. I wonder, Tristan, because you've talked about different ways of thinking about restitution. I just wondered if you could expand, because there seems to be some conflict in terms of the restitution communities. Some people are talking about return of objects. Some people are talking about permanent loans. Some people are talking about restitution in a much broader context. I just wondered, particularly in relationship to the Magdala collection, the V&A, just how you thinking through those processes of restitution, and does the framework which is outlined in the report provide any guidance for you?
Thank you. We fall firmly into the fourth category of other forms of return because, as the Afford report spells out, under our legal foundation in 1983, trustees are not allowed to deaccession items from the collection. And there was kind of good reasons for that in the past, because great works of art, not least plaster casts of South Asian temples, which have since been destroyed, were removed by trustees because they didn't think they were of interest to the current generation. So there is a clear legal ruling there. But we also understand that the Magdala collection, going exactly to Elsie's quote from Gladstone, who did not want those items on display in British museums, and that was partly not as it were born of a great sort of admiration, I don't think, for Africa, but it was born of his evangelical Christian sort of theology as much as the question of kind of colonial looting. So we are, so we did, I mean, first of all, we had a display about the Magdala collection, was very, very clear about the colonial origins of the collection. We used Gladstone's words in the display. We used voices from the Ethiopian diaspora community. We worked closely with Fraser and his colleagues at the Ethiopian embassy. And then we wanted to take the conversation forward. And we have made, I mean, because they are subject to a formal restitution claim by the Ethiopian government. And what we've said to the Ethiopian government is that we would be really keen to have these on long-term loan in Addis. And quite understandably, politics in Ethiopia and civil society in Ethiopia says, hold on, why do we need to borrow from you stuff you took from us? And what we're trying to do now is work out a way whereby these items do go to Addis, are on show to the public, but take cognizance of this difficult political and legal situation. And so we're waiting to hear back from the foreign and cultural ministries in Addis, but we totally understand this shouldn't be dictated by our timetable. We totally understand that the Ethiopian government has a lot on its plate at the moment. So we're keen to take this a step forward at the right time. But I think what the Afford report is also so useful in saying is that the British government and DFID and DCMS should have a role to play here. So if there is support in terms of environmental conditioning of galleries, in terms of conservation help, in terms of partnership around funded PhDs that build up a long-term loan, that would be brilliant. My vision is for these items to return to Addis, to be on display in Addis for 30, 40 years, come back to the V&A for 5 years, go back to Addis, and we build up that relationship. And similarly on the Ashanti gold weights, which again, Elsie's absolutely right. These were displayed at the South Kensington Museum, not as great artifacts of design, but as trophies of imperialism. We're not waiting for a formal claim there. What we want to do is, and we should come back to Elsie on this, is build up relationships in Ghana. So again, we can have these on long-term loan in Ghana. And we've just appointed for our V&A East development in Stratford, Gus Casely-Hayford, who has great contacts in Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa and Ghana. And so that's a project we'll be taking forward over the next couple of years as well.
Elsie, I think this has come up in relationship to the Ethiopians. There's a problem, isn't there, in terms of loaning things to Ghana or Ethiopia, things which were stolen. I'm just wondering how one deals with that, because there is something deeply unethical, I think, about that statement. I mean, I'd just like you to respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think there is some work to be done on language, clearly. But there's also just a simple recognition that many of these items are trophies of empire, and as such are part of a much larger conversation that's going on, not just about the items themselves, but the items as being representative of the mindset of empire. So I think couching the exchange, if you like, of both of knowledge and understanding of how the empire still works, and the acquisition of the items. I think there's a great potential there for learning about the legacy of empire, how empire was and how we still live with empire. So I think in a sense, what we need to do is, I'm interested in case studies, you know, how that process actually works and how the physical delivery of those items works, because I think in that you'll find a catalyst for action, and we'll learn lots and lots of things about how we should act. Yeah, so I mean, it's great that Gus is now at the V&A, and I think that there can be a dialogue with Otumfuo, whose ancestral heritage, or he's the custodian of those items, and how he, as a custodian, feels that it would be right, restitution could be done in a proper way, because there are all sorts of religious and cultural and political processes that attach to this, the restitution. And I think we can learn a lot by taking maybe the Magdala and the Ashanti as test cases, and then drawing up, if you like, a constitution for good practice. Because it's not going to be a one size fits all. You know, the return of Magdala isn't going to be the same as the return of the Ashanti, isn't going to be the same as the return of precious items to the Indian and other Indian subcontinent, other places. But I think we just need to start, and we need to learn very fast about how best to do this.
I think this brings me on to my final question. One of the criticisms of the Sarr-Savoy report was that it assumes that all items would be returned, and that there's kind of, you know, a simple process in that process of restitution. And one of the problems that's come back is the wider current geopolitical context with some of the items were returned. And I was just wondering how we balance that act between the kind of ethical and moral claims to return the objects and the practical realities of the context in which they may be returned. And I was just wondering, that's a quite nuanced debate. And I was just wondering how we can begin to develop that argument, or that discussion rather. Tristan, do you want to start?
I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, we've just heard from Elsie as to the nature in which some of the Ashanti gold weights could be returned to non-state actors, and when we think, for example, of the Magdala collection, which in one sense should be returned at, you know, state level, but there will obviously be claims on them within, you know, for example, the churches and other parts of the country. It seems to me, though, that for an institution like the V&A, we would deal with the state level, and then it's a matter for, you know, internal conversations about how they are then shared and owned appropriately. I mean, I think our and again, it's not up to us to sort of you know, determine the you know, where they would be held, but I think we would be very strong about ensuring public access and free and open access to these collections as part of any potential loan. And Elsie's right also that the language has to change, and this is one of the challenges we have, that this old-fashioned language of loan rightly raises hackles, right, you know, in communities and governments across the country, and we've got to be alert to that. But I don't think it should be a barrier. I mean, I think you can put all sorts of barriers in. What about this? What about that? They could claim it, and that could claim, and actually, you just have to keep kind of pushing forward. So it's complex, and actually that speaks again to Elsie's point about having you know, knowledge on the ground and partnerships and connections and building up trust. And I think, you know, finally, what we also want to ensure is that we don't, in a sense, we're not just interested in sending the Magdala collection to Addis. We're also interested in lending some of our Turners. We're also interested in lending some of our Wedgwood. We're also interested in lending some Donatellos. We want, you know, that kind of partnership, which is beyond the sort of the issue. We need to address the issue, and then we build it up into a kind of richer cultural partnership.
I turn it to you, Dan, because obviously yours is a pan-European group and initiative. I was just wondering how those, because obviously they're going to be different national approaches to this, dealing with different actors. I was just wondering how that works within the context of the Benin Dialogue Group.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I guess I can make 2 points. You know, on the one side, it's what does a dialogue really mean in the UK, you know, after Colston. So I think we're very aware, as we heard from Monikachi at the outset, that restitution is a long-standing African movement, but also, of course, is the fallism movement. And I attended the first event, or my first event that I attended to remove the Colston statue was in early 1998. And we've had a generation of dialogue about the removal of a bit of the infrastructure of white supremacy, that really led to absolutely nothing and nothing changing. I think increasingly there's an understanding that the displays inside museums also share that history of their role in the visual economy of whiteness, and that's why white curators like me have to do some of the work here, if you like, to understand them and to start to dismantle. Because from fallism we learned that the removal is not some iconoclasm, it's not a cancellation, it isn't a destruction. It's about the renewal of an institution and a city and a culture. So, at this, moment in history, that we're in, in the UK, when we're having to face up to those, imperial histories in all of their ongoing, nature, and the displays in museums were built to make the violence last. So that's why, actually, restitution is important. And that leads me to my second of the 2 points, which is that restitution is already business as usual, even for the national institutions. So in terms of removing the physical parts of ancestors, the skulls and other human remains, this is uncontroversial. This has been the law for a long amount of time. Restitution in the context of Holocaust, the law was altered absolutely rightly. And, in advance of that legal change, all these same arguments were put, that there's a legal challenge, where will it end, the whataboutism, in terms of restitution, the third leg of the stool, as well as the human remains question, as well as the spoliation Holocaust, is spoliation empire. So the cultural objects in museums, we would never consider if we return a skull to insist it was on display. When they're returned, they are normally buried, destroyed. We would never consider loaning an object that was looted in the Holocaust. We would return it. It's exactly the same for empire. So really, above all, over dialogue. This is about a moment where we need to see dialogue, absolutely, but actually the movement out of dialogue into action.
And lastly, Elsie, before we turn to questions, I was just wondering where you think we're moving towards within this restitution journey, because it's quite clear that we are progressing, even though it's slow, we are moving towards some kind of change. Where do you think the next steps are going to come from?
Well, I think that to me, the change has happened. Because when we were having, Oni and Bernie Grant and others were having this conversation in 1995, it just seemed the height of absurdity. And, you know, you very often get into what Paul rightly calls the whataboutism, you know, where is it going to end? And now it seems that what we're talking about is the how and the when rather than the why. So I think in that sense, I'm really pleased that this conversation is happening. And I think the thing to remember is that for the Ashanti, this history is today. It's not 100 years ago. The people who made the artifacts, the descendants of the people who made those artifacts, the royal goldsmiths, are still royal goldsmiths. And their skills are still being passed on. So I would just like to echo some of what Tristram's saying, is that the V&A was talking about learning from these artifacts. The school children and the students in Ghana also want to learn from these artifacts. And in that sense, you know, they belong to the nation and they belong to the world, but their physical location can be much closer to their source of origin. And should be.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions and answers from the panel, from the audience. Do we have any questions, Paul? No questions.
No, there are a number of questions in the Q&A box.
Right. Okay. Right. So the first question is, I'll take these in a couple of things. So the first one is about the law change. Why does the law prohibit the return of art objects and ancestral remains? And then the second one, if we could take these together, is a question which is specifically about the Magdala loot. Why should it go back to Addis, I think is the question. So if we could just deal with those two questions. Dan, are you comfortable in talking about the legal context?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Because not many people know that there is a law prohibiting the kind of selling off or return of objects. If you could just briefly tell us what that
sure,
might
yeah.
be.
So there are various controls over the process, you know, that if you like a museum can enter into to deaccession. But I really think it's so important to underline the different situations of the national museums as compared to the non-nationals. So the university museums and the local authority museums, where most of the loot is in this country. You know, there are more of the Benin, you know, objects outside of the British Museum in the UK, you know, than there are in the British Museum. You know, there is material from all of these incidents that we've heard about, from Ethiopia, Ghana, but also Sudan, you know, Egypt and so forth. You know, these objects are across the country, and they're the only, you know, sort of your process actually is, you know, one that has to be led by the trustees. So when a Cambridge college decided it wished to return an object to Nigeria, it simply decided to. It was simply a meeting of the trustees. So, you know, really, I mean, what I'm hoping we're going to see in the wake of this report, you know, and importantly, a report that underlines that that sort of loans isn't really restitution. It's something else. Maybe it's helpful, but it is another process. In terms of actual returns, it is the non-national museum. So I'd encourage everyone watching this, to think about, what is in, your local museum in the UK, or which other UK or other international museums one might, approach, because we need to understand these questions in part are about a relationship in between the former colonial state and, if you like, the current independent, African nation, but it's also about a whole set of non-state actors as well. And there the legal situation is much, much simpler.
I suppose for Tristan, the question was, why should the material go back to Addis? Which I'm not quite sure what the question is there, but why specifically Addis? And
well, I mean, I think we're going to hear from Fraser from the Ethiopian embassy later, but we obviously deal with the embassy and we deal with the government, so it's a kind of decision for them. But also, I think there's an understanding that the facilities and access and conservation requirements are best there. But it speaks to some of the challenges of this, that these items were themselves acquired by Emperor Triodos from other parts of what we would describe in modern terms as Ethiopia. So these objects themselves have a history of entering the royal collection and were taken from other parts of the nation, the contemporary nation. But that's really not our call. So what we're keen to is try and find the facility to allow the relevant Ethiopian authorities to say where they should be on show. The trustees, and I completely understand there are some other points about, say they're not yours. The problem for trustees is that legally, as matters stand, they do belong to the V&A, and so the trustees have a responsibility of conservation around them, a legal responsibility. And what we want to do is ensure that, to Elsie's point about the Ashanti gold weights being closer to the source communities, that contemporary Ethiopians can see these works of great wonder for themselves, and we'll keep trying to get there.
I think just in terms of time, the question that's come up, which has come up in the report, of what role does copying, either digitally or 3D copying, have in this process? And I suppose the second one is, what are museums in the UK going to do to move this decolonisation process forward in the light of this report? I mean, Elsie, perhaps you could speak to that first, in terms of if you think there's any role for digital copies within this process, or any other kind of copy that, yeah.
Well, I remember we had a meeting with the British Museum and somebody from the Benin royal family, and there was an offer to give the royal family a copy of the original treasure. And the response was, well, I tell you what, why don't we do a deal? You give us back the original and you can keep the copy. So I think, there's a conversation to be had about who is the principal stakeholder. And of course, it's a great thing to share, but what we're talking about really is restitution. And I think we mustn't be distracted from that important course of saying that the items themselves represent an important historical action, important historical fact, and that's what we must deal with. The rest of it, yes, of course, there are lots of creative conversations that can be had, but I think that we can get distracted by, lots of great and wonderful ways of sharing, but they're at the heart of this. There are real physical items which represent a lot of pain and suffering, and which continues for the communities from which they originated.
So I just wonder if you could just end the panel first, Tristan, by talking about how you think the V&A in relationship to talking about restitution, the process of decolonisation, perhaps even the wider context of general debates around equality within the kind of museum sphere. If you could just briefly just tell us where you think we might be moving towards in the next couple of years.
Well, I mean, I think a museum like the V&A has a particular responsibility within this conversation. We were born of the colonial moment. The collections emerged partly from the East India Company repository. So in a sense, at one level, I've always had a reservation about decolonize the museum, because you can't decolonize the V&A. It's absolutely embedded in the entire foundation of the institution. And with that, as Gus has been reminding us in some of our V&A blogs recently, the apparatus of race and racism that came with that. So, and there's no doubt there's a huge amount of energy within the institution to make sure that we lead on this. What are we going to do over the next few years in this space? We're going to keep the conversations hopefully going with Fraser and colleagues at the MC. We're going to, as Elsie says, try to land the Magdala collection and the Ashanti gold weights as test cases of what we can do. We need to diversify our workforce far more effectively so that we're able to identify different narratives through the collection of Black and Black Caribbean heritage. We've got a particular focus on diversifying our fashion collections over the coming years. They're very Eurocentric, and if we're going to be a global museum, we have to be much more alert to that. And similarly around programming. What I'm very clear about, and since I came in three years ago, was total transparency. So when we did the Magdala collection, it was about the looting. It was about the booty. It was about the process by which they entered the collection. If you look at our display on the Ashanti gold weights at the moment, it's about Sir Garnet Wolsey's imperial trophy hunting, and then how the items were displayed in South Kensington. But the only kind of reservation I would have within this, and this is where I probably take a bit of issue with Dan, whose work I think is spectacular at the Pitt Rivers, is that empire was the natural form of government for millions of people for thousands of years around the world. And so it's only natural that museums have items which come from empire, and whether it's the Mughal Empire, whether it's the Persian Empire, or whether it's the British Empire, those will be in the collections. So to say that empire and any collections connected to empire are inherently wrong and bad seems to me ahistorical. What we have to do is make sure that the consequences of the British Empire in terms of race and racism are dealt with, and we are alert to. But I fear some of the discourse at the moment, and Dan's sort of reference to the Holocaust alongside empire didn't seem to me quite right, when if you think of how countries are governed over the last thousands of years, empire has been part of that. So we just need to be, it seems to me, kind of alert to the history of this.
Okay, I'd really like to thank you. That's a really interesting debate. Unfortunately, this is the beginning of a conversation, and lots of the issues are going to be debated over the next coming years. There is no simple answer, as we know. Anybody who's been doing this work for a long time, there are no simple answers. What we'd like to move to in the next panel is to look at these issues specifically from an African perspective, and look at some of the barriers that we take. So I'd like to thank Dan, Tristram, and Elsie for being our panelists today. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce for the next panel, Mr. Angela Doe from the Embassy of Benin in France, Dr. Fraser Haley from the Ethiopian Embassy in London, and Wakike Wanyioka from the Open Foundation, and I apologise for mangling your name. So if we could start off, I think we've had a lot of discussions around the Savoy report and some of the wider context. What I'd like to talk about today is some of the barriers, because there are barriers, and African governments have asked, and particularly in terms of Ethiopia, for a long time to have some of these items returned. If you could just talk a little bit about your experience of African governments and institutions requesting the return of these objects from places around the V&A, the British Museum. I wonder if we could go to Dr. Haley first.
Sorry. Yeah, so I don't know if everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
But yeah, first let me start off by saying obviously that we welcome the report and wish to congratulate the authors and everyone involved for all of their hard work. We think that the report captures quite comprehensively the challenges that even we have faced in our experiences, and really showcases the opportunities for further work in this space. In relation to the question regarding barriers or obstacles to restitution, obviously the Ethiopian government has a long-standing position on the issue of stolen artifacts and loot, which is effectively that they were stolen in an unjust manner. And so when they are being returned to the countries from which they were stolen from, there has to be some acknowledgement that comes with that. I think the V&A in particular, and I wish to thank Dr. Tristram Hunt as well, I think they're doing some really important work in relation to the manner in which the conversation is currently taking place. I think his radical transparency is unfortunately a departure from the approach that we have seen from other cultural institutions here in the UK.
Hello, yes, you got cut off. Maybe it's because, well, it's just that you called me and then I was waiting.
I think, sorry, I think someone's not muted. I think I can sum it up really in three ways. I think the obstacles in particular that we've seen are, one, there's an institutional obstinance, which is kind of I don't know if it emanates from a fear that collections will be emptied, or if it comes from another place. But effectively, I think with each institution you encounter, there does seem to be a very different approach. In one place, you will be faced with the transparency that Tristan talked about earlier, while in other places, there will be an abject lack of desire to deal in the issues at all. The second element of it is there is still a prevalence of these paternalistic attitudes within museum management, I think, especially when the questions are first raised. And I think here again, you know, we've heard the kind of classic narratives about, oh, but if the items were returned, can they be adequately cared for or managed in kind of the host countries that they're going back to? And here again, I think it comes back to there needs to be sensitivity. There needs to be greater cultural awareness. And that comes with an acknowledgement of the history. You know, I think there was a question asked in the previous panel about why should these items go home? Effectively, I fully side with the words of Elsie. You know, this history is today. This isn't about some bygone era in which, you know, it's a different people, different generation, so it's irrelevant to us. Ethiopians up and down the country feel as strongly that these items should be home. And whether that's in Addis Ababa or Mekelle or Gondar or Adama, anywhere, these different places can house these artifacts based on the host community's needs. But fundamentally, these are products of Ethiopian ingenuity, Ethiopian culture, and a general kind of innovation that existed in our country at that time. So they have to go home because the people who created them must also be able to learn from them. And this is about that idea of restoration and making things whole. And then finally, the other obstacle that we're faced is the passing the buck syndrome, I think, is the idea that it's not us, it's the law. It's not us, it's the trustees. It's not us, it's the environment. And I think here, what it comes back to, and I enjoyed Professor Dan's words on this, is the idea that it's ownership. You know, the institutions themselves, so long as they believe in the idea of, you can call it what you want, decolonization or restitution or dismantling white supremacy or colonialism, the institutions themselves have to take ownership of that agenda and drive it forward, kind of irrespective of whether the Ethiopian government or any other government is knocking at their door to request the items to be returned. And I think that comes with the idea that you have a comprehensive reading of history, which allows you to take responsibility for the things which have happened that have led to where we are today. So that's a really important point, which I would like to underline. This isn't just about host communities asking for things back. It's also about the places which house these items having a fuller reading of history and working towards those ends. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. Dan, I was just wondering if you'd like to speak to your experience of the Benin artifacts that are held in the UK.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, Angelo Dan from Paris.
Yes.
Can I make my intervention in French, please?
Okay. So yes, you can. Yes, you can make your. There is space for the interpreters to do that.
Okay,
so go ahead, please.
I could do it in English, but I will
No,
not be
no.
more comfortable. Okay.
If you're comfortable in French, please do it in French. Yes,
I'm
we have interpreter. So if you don't know Zoom, there is an interpretation.
Okay.
Button at the bottom. Sorry, not for you, for the audience. There's an interpretation button at the bottom of your screen that you can use, which will translate for you. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Dan.
Ben, merci beaucoup. Je tiens d'abord à remercier Afford pour l'invitation qui m'a été adressée. Et je note que le sujet qui est au cœur donc de cet échange, de l'échange de ce jour, revêt une actualité brûlante ici en France, parce que comme vous le savez certainement, la France a passé la semaine dernière seulement un projet de loi qui va autoriser la restitution de biens culturels au Bénin et au Sénégal. Alors, je note cette évolution récente du sujet en France comme une avancée décisive dans les négociations qu'au niveau du Bénin, nous avons entamées avec la France depuis 4 années maintenant, bientôt 4 années. Parce que je rappelle que c'est en 2016, notamment le 26 août 2016, que le gouvernement du Bénin a saisi, donc le gouvernement français, d'une demande de restitution de biens culturels en ciblant de manière particulière pour entamer ce processus les objets royaux qui ont été emportés du royaume de Dahomey au Bénin lors de la conquête française, par l'armée française, lors de la conquête du royaume de Dahomey. Alors, nous avons, tout au long de ce processus, depuis 4 années, nous sommes passés par des hauts et des bas. D'abord des bas, parce que, comme vous le savez, au début de ce processus déjà, nous avons reçu une fin de non-recevoir de la partie française, du gouvernement français, qui s'était fondée. Et là, ça me permet d'ailleurs d'aborder les questions des obstacles qui vous intéressent. Le premier obstacle auquel nous avons été confrontés en ce qui concerne le Bénin, c'était les obstacles juridiques, puisque le refus du gouvernement français du 12 décembre 2016 précisément pointait les obstacles juridiques liés à la protection exceptionnelle dont bénéficient les collections des musées en France. Il s'agit, on nous a opposé notamment les principes d'inaliénabilité, d'imprescriptibilité et d'incessibilité qui sont attachés au patrimoine culturel, au patrimoine muséal en France. Alors, ça a été donc le principal fondement du non qui nous a été opposé. Mais fort heureusement, la situation a évolué puisque dans son discours du 28 novembre 2017, le président Emmanuel Macron à Ouagadougou s'est engagé donc à favoriser des restitutions temporaires et définitives du patrimoine africain en Afrique dans un délai de 5 ans. Alors ça a relancé le processus en ce qui nous concerne et c'est là où on note également que, et mon collègue d'Éthiopie l'a souligné tout à l'heure, qu'il y a aussi des obstacles politiques ce qui avait été refusé par le gouvernement français sous un régime précédent, notamment sous la présidence de François Hollande, a pu être possible parce que le président Macron s'est engagé à favoriser ce processus. Ça veut dire que la volonté politique dans les pays occidentaux constitue une donnée essentielle pour faire avancer ce sujet. Donc, c'est les obstacles politiques que j'aborde en rappelant ce fait. Et puis, nous avons été confrontés à ce que je pourrais aussi appeler un obstacle technique dans ce processus, c'est qu'il était question à un moment donné de faire les inventaires. Nous avons un problème d'inventaire parce que lorsque le gouvernement du Bénin a introduit sa demande de restitution, nous n'avions pas encore à ce moment-là une évaluation précise des objets emportés par l'armée française lors de la conquête du royaume de Dahomey en 1892. Et sur ce point en particulier, le rapport Savoie-Sarr a été très utile pour nous puisque ce rapport a donné une base d'estimation du patrimoine africains détenus en France, notamment dans le cadre du musée du Quai Branly à Paris. Et on sait, par exemple, depuis, d'après ce rapport, que les biens du royaume de Dahomey qui se trouvent dans le musée du Quai Branly à Paris sont estimés à un peu plus de 3000. Alors, avec les évolutions récentes que nous avons connues, c'est que ce que moi j'en tire, c'est que le Bénin a bien fait, dès le départ, de cibler de manière précise les biens qui font l'objet de sa demande de restitution, à savoir de manière prioritaire les biens emportés par l'armée française lors de la conquête du royaume de Dahomey. Mais ensuite, nous avons eu à privilégier dans nos échanges avec la partie française la négociation et la coopération qui ont permis des avancées décisives. Je rappelle que le Bénin, par exemple, a privilégié des échanges à tous les niveaux décisionnels pertinents. Au niveau politique, il y a eu des échanges fréquents entre les chefs d'État des deux pays. Nous avons eu entre 2016 et 2020 aujourd'hui au moins 3 rencontres présidentielles qui ont permis d'aborder le sujet entre le Bénin et la France. Mais nous avons également eu des échanges ministériels. Nous avons eu des visites ministérielles entre les deux pays. La plus récente en date côté français, c'était la visite que le ministre de la Culture français d'alors, M. Franck Guester, a effectuée au Bénin en décembre 2019. Mais plus récemment, en février 2020, donc il y a à peine 4 mois, nous avons 2 membres du gouvernement béninois qui sont également rendus ici en France pour faire évoluer la discussion au plan opérationnel. Donc pour nous, ça a été vraiment la négociation a été un moyen efficace, j'allais dire, puisque, comme je vous le disais tout à l'heure, pas plus tard que dans la semaine dernière, donc, le gouvernement français a introduit au Parlement, notamment le 16 juillet, le projet de loi qui va permettre de déclasser, qui va permettre le déclassement des biens réclamés par le Bénin, mais aussi par le Sénégal, en vue, d'une part, de leur transfert juridique, de leur transfert de propriété juridique, et ensuite, d'autre part, de leur transfert physique, parce que c'est de ça qu'il s'agit pour nous. Nous avons réclamé ces biens-là pour les voir être physiquement transférés au Bénin. Donc, nous n'allons pas nous contenter seulement d'un transfert de propriété juridique. Nous sommes en pourparlers avec la partie française pour organiser ensuite le transfert physique donc, de ces 26 œuvres dont la restitution a été annoncée par le président Emmanuel Macron le 23 novembre 2018 à l'occasion de la remise du rapport Savoie-Sarr. Nous sommes donc en discussion pour récupérer ces 26 œuvres-là. Voilà un peu le point que je peux vous faire très rapidement, puisque nous sommes tenus par des contraintes de temps, de l'état du processus en ce qui concerne le Bénin, de notre expérience, qui est une expérience du reste très enrichissante, qui prouve que grâce à une volonté politique, mais aussi grâce à une négociation bilatérale, par le dialogue et le partenariat, on peut obtenir des avancées dans le cadre de ce processus historique, parce que ça va conduire, comme d'ailleurs l'ont souhaité Felwine Sarr et Bénédicte Savoie dans leur rapport, ça va conduire quand même à une rénovation, à une nouvelle éthique relationnelle entre les pays africains et les pays européens. Merci.
Thank you. I was just wondering if we could turn to you, Mr. Wanyo Ika. Can you speak to us about the Open Society's dialogue around these issues, and how do you think, and give us a more kind of pan-European perspective on how this is working across Europe?
Thank you, Janice. And just first to congratulate Afford on this report. I think it's a really great report. It adds to the conversation that's going on and the data and opinions about how to resolve these issues. From the Open Society Foundation, what I wanted to highlight is obviously we've taken significant interest with the Charles Savoy report, and what is critical is what we are trying to do in terms of ensuring the repatriation and restitution. So we've taken a strategy that one tries to address the issue of government, and in fact that's partly what Savoy report was trying to contribute in terms of providing as much information as possible to governments to be able to engage on this issue. We've taken interest in civil society and building the capacity, especially of civil society, to engage with the issue, which we think it's extremely critical. We've taken interest in the academia, being able to engage with this issue. As you will note, there hasn't been as much robust engagement at the academia level in the continent, but that is building up. What has been critical, I think, is the academia in the diaspora and Afford, or at least what Afford is doing, plus other institutions attest to that. So that's partly trying to build capacity to engage with these issues at the academia or at the technical level. Certainly in terms of the issues, some of them are complex, some of them are political in nature, in fact, significantly more political than legal, but we're also looking at opportunities that engage legal solutions, or at least using the law to be able to accelerate or catalyze the process of repatriation and restitution. And I can speak to that a bit more concretely about some of the what I think are the legal and litigation strategy that can be employed by governments and civil society.
Thank you. I think in the last panel and also there's a lot of emphasis on partnership working. And I was just wondering how cultural institutions in Africa can engage in effective partnerships, but also to make sure that those partnerships are equitable. Because even in the last panel, there's still a lot of paternalistic language being used around the terminology, around the objects and how they're described, how the ownership is assigned. All those seem to imbue the discussions. And I was just wondering, what strategies can African cultural institutions actually make sure that when they are engaging in partnerships with European organisations or governments, how do we ensure that they are equitable? I'd like to turn to you first, Dr. Haley. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, so I can speak from the Ethiopian government's standpoint, and especially Ethiopian cultural institutions. The approach we take often is that it's part and parcel of our diplomatic activities. So there is kind of a cultural, you can call it a department or kind of a attaché, which works closely in relation to partnerships and twinning. So in the case of here in the UK, last year, during the time when our Minister of Culture, Dr. Hirut Kasau, was in the UK to receive the remains of Emperor Theodros II from the National Army Museum, we also were able to facilitate a partnership between our National Archives and Library Agency in Ethiopia and the British Library here in the UK. And we were fundamental to the formation of that partnership as kind of their liaison on the ground here in the UK. So I think there are opportunities, but there needs to be a joined up approach on the part of cultural institutions. I think oftentimes the inequity that we talk of in these partnerships is maybe a product of a lack of awareness about the context within those partnerships are being made. So I think here, especially embassies or diplomatic missions as one element of that relationship can act to kind of, pave the way or pave the ground ahead of the cultural institutions which are interested in striking up these partnerships.
Thank you. And I just want to think about how the Open Society thinks it can actually embed those kind of equity, but within those relationships, because there is there's a potential for some quite different power engagements within those partnerships across academia, across cultural institutions, across governments. How do you think the Open Society would be able to engage within that?
Janice, just to start with, I think it's critical to emphasize that we see our role as facilitative. Facilitative to allow, whether it's institutions, cultural institutions, or other advocacy type institutions that will be in this space, whether it's academia that is keen on the intellectual aspect and coming up with solutions, or whether it's governments and regional blocs in terms of how they engage. We see our role as just helping to facilitate that, not so much to prescribe how the engagement should be undertaken. Having said that, and just from my own perspective, I think, and it's good that Dr. Fraser went before me, because he said something very fundamental. He talked about a joined up approach in the context of cultural institutions. But I think the joined up approach actually needs to start at the level of government. We are seeing quite a lot of efforts at different governmental levels in terms of negotiating with, whether it's the European, various European governments where these artifacts are held, the UK, or even North America, engaging directly the diplomatic aspects that Dr. Fraser was talking about. But what we haven't seen as much is at the continental level, a concerted, strategic, methodical engagement. And at least I know the conversation has got there, and departments of AU, for example, the Department of Social Affairs, are looking at this. But we hope that the process can be accelerated, because as we note, this issue is actually more complex, and at some point will require not just bilateral engagements, either between governments, or bilateral engagements between institutions with museums where these artifacts are held, but will require even regional bloc engagement. It may require development of conventions, multilateral conventions that speaks to some of these issues. Of course, there's debate back and forth whether that's a good thing or not. And so I think even before we go to the cultural institutions and the civil society, governments have to lead or have to be at the front. Having said that, I also think organizations and governments have to be ready to use all tools available to unlock some of these challenges, or some of these roadblocks that are encountered. When you go to the report and you see the description of how law is not facilitating this process, then you know there's something that requires to be done in terms of legal or use of legal tools to unlock that, whether it's a parliamentary amendments that the previous panel was talking about, or just litigation. Obviously, there are questions: where do you bring cases? Do you bring cases in jurisdictions in Europe, or do you bring those cases in the continent? And how do you go about it? But why are you bringing those cases? Are you bringing them to be able to get a solution? Are you bringing them as tactics or tools of emphasizing and amplifying advocacy? And I think those are the things that we are starting to see whether it's cultural institutions or other civil society organizations, because it's not just the cultural one. There are institutions, civil society institutions in the continent who are just interested in the right to truth. And significantly, this engages the right to truth. And so they are also getting into this space. So hopefully that collaboration doesn't just happen horizontally, it also happens also vertically in terms of the interface between civil society and governments, as well as regional and continental blocks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dan, I was just wondering, because one of the questions that's come up within the question and answer was how, and I think this speaks to something what the Open Society is saying, how can the diaspora communities be involved in this process of restitution? Because if we're talking about it, obviously in France, you had a legal framework which allowed for this. This doesn't exist in the UK and in other parts of Europe. How can the diaspora communities come together to actually begin to have a kind of concerted, joined up effort, both to support what's going on within the governments in the question for returns, but also an awareness campaign? Because I think that's also part of the process that needs to be, that Afford talks about. How can those diaspora communities, and are you having those discussions on the ground with your diaspora communities?
Oui, merci madame. C'est une question importante, la question de l'appropriation. Parce que, comme vous le savez, la plupart des objets de patrimoine dont nos pays réclament aujourd'hui la restitution n'étaient pas à l'origine des objets destinés à être exposés, présentés dans des musées. Ces objets avaient d'autres fonctions dans notre histoire, avaient d'autres rôles, d'autres fonctionnalités pour nous. Donc, pour nous, la question de la resocialisation de ces objets qu'on va nous transférer est une question majeure. Et cela emporte également pour conséquence une sensibilisation de nos communautés, une sensibilisation de nos citoyens à l'appropriation vraiment de ces enjeux. Et vous avez évoqué la question de comment associer la diaspora. Pour nous, oui, ça reste un enjeu fondamental. Et au mois de février dernier, lorsque le ministre de la Culture du Bénin et le ministre des Affaires étrangères ont effectué une mission conjointe ici à Paris pour rencontrer leurs homologues français et faire avancer nos discussions dans le cadre de la restitution des biens culturels, nous avons eu un échange, nous avons organisé une rencontre avec la diaspora béninoise en France. Cette rencontre a permis justement aux deux ministres d'expliquer les enjeux de cette opération à notre diaspora et à sensibiliser la diaspora à se joindre au Bénin, à se joindre au gouvernement pour que nous fassions de ce processus de restitution un succès. Un succès en termes de sensibilisation, quant aussi à la nécessité pour nous désormais de préserver notre patrimoine culturel. C'est un enjeu important. Vous savez qu'en 2006, l'Union africaine s'est dotée par exemple d'une charte de la renaissance culturelle qui nous invite, nos pays, à nous doter de structures fortes, capables d'une part de préserver notre patrimoine culturel, mais capables également de prévenir les trafics illicites et les sorties illicites des territoires des pays africains des biens culturels. Tout cela offre ici aujourd'hui pour nous des potentiels de situation pour agir dans le sens d'une meilleure préservation de nos biens culturels, et la diaspora a un rôle fondamental à jouer. Je signale d'ailleurs que le rapport Savoir-Ça souligne si bien la question que ce rapport recommande justement aux pays africains de définir des stratégies de réappropriation des biens culturels. Ce travail est en cours au Bénin et nous avons, en ce qui concerne notre pays, mis en place un comité d'experts national qui travaille sur tous les aspects de cette problématique-là, y compris la question de la sensibilisation. Donc, un comité d'experts composé d'historiens, de juristes, mais aussi de médiateurs culturels, de diplomates, travaillent sur la question pour qu'une fois que ces biens-là seront restitués au Bénin, qu'il y ait un travail d'appropriation qui se fasse, mais que cela aille de pair avec tout un travail de réhabilitation de nos infrastructures culturelles et muséales. Et c'est d'ailleurs tout le sens de la coopération muséale et patrimoniale que nous sommes en train de développer avec la France afin d'adosser la restitution des biens culturels à un partenariat culturel global. Il s'agit pour nous d'intégrer des questions importantes de ce processus comme la coopération scientifique et culturelle, la formation, le renforcement des capacités qui est un enjeu majeur, mais également d'autres aspects comme les échanges d'expertise. Parce que n'oubliez pas que derrière tout ça également, il y a le c'est pour ça également que l'échange d'expertise reste.
Okay, thank you. I think that we're running out of time, which is perhaps why we're getting a bit of a delay. So I'd really like to thank you. I think the things that have come up in the debate are the importance of partnership working, the importance of developing a dialogue, locating the kind of the diaspora communities and its relationship to both the objects and to the debates around there. But I think that we also need to think about what are the legal avenues to drive forward this change within the UK context, and that we need to have consistent dialogues both within the continent around that and within its diasporic communities. And I'd like to thank all the participants for being very patient with us. We know that this is the beginning of a dialogue. This isn't the end of the process, and we want to engage with everybody. So we ask you to read the report, comment on us, work with us, attend our next events so we can all develop the thought. And I'd like to hand over to Onikechi.
Yes,
Onikechi. So I thank you. So I've run a little bit over time, but I hope you bear with me for that. So thank you once again to all the panelists, and I hope that we can drive this agenda forwards very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janice, for chairing the session, the two sessions so expertly. I wanted to thank all the panelists and contributors for their rich insights, and I think there's a lot of work for us to take forward. And also Alexander the Great for his musical contribution at the start, which I think set the scene expertly, as griots always do. I wanted to thank Paul Timola and Richard Lee, who are part of our policy and engagement team for the mapping report and producing the policy briefs, and also other forward staff for their support of the policy and engagement team. And then my final thanks again to the Open Society Foundations for all their support for the process. And then finally to you, the audience who have attended today and who have participated and added your own questions. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to really look at the richness of the questions, but there were many of those, and what we will do is print those out and share them with you so that we can also see the kind of areas that you've been interested in, and look for ways where we can perhaps respond to some of the questions that you have. In terms of future steps, we intend to hold, as Janice said, further webinars and meetings around specific campaigns, whether it's the Magdala campaign, the Ashanti campaign, the Egyptian collections, the Benin collections. And we hope to explore ways of implementing actions along the 4 pathways that we've identified. As everybody has said, there's a lot of work to do. We particularly look forward to working with all stakeholders here and in Africa, whether governments, museums, lawyers, and community groups, so that we can advance action along those 4 pathways. Please contact Afford, myself, or Paul for partnership work if you're interested in getting involved, whether as a member of a community group or one of those other institutions. Finally, we will finish with another musical contribution, this time from a young spoken word artist. They've been inspired by an artist called Fusion, who provided a beat for young spoken word artists to respond to the Return of the Icons theme. And we're calling it the Return of the Icons beat. And Sudanese-born Becky Bex is the author of Bedroom Poetry Collection, and she's driven by her 3 pillars of laughter, love, and literature. And she reflects here on her own personal journey on the Return of the Icons. So until the next event, please, we will leave with Becky, who takes us on a journey being from Sudan and South Sudan and what these icons mean to her. I think we're having problems with the sound, but we will share Becky Bex's item. So we will close, but share that with all those who have attended through a link. But it's for some reason Zoom isn't allowing us to play out. So thank you, everybody, and we will close the meeting.
Does it work now? It's a shame. Why is it doing that? Well, I'll just stop the share then. There's no point. What happened there?